Rags are far more curious creatures than they seem on first look. I always thought they resembled piano waltzers, but the form they're closest to is the march, and specifically the American march. More on that later. I'm going to define rags in two ways, the second of which you don't hear other people talk about, which I think is strange. Anyway, that's the first half of the video. For the second half, you'll get an animated version of my absolute favourite Joplin rag with a score filled with information. Oh, let me quickly shout out my second channel, Enjoy Everything Else, where currently Star Wars is under my special Polonius microscope. Okay, time to ask. A rag is a type of piano piece made famous by Scott Joplin more than a century ago, and we can define a rag in two ways, through structure and through style. Structure sounds a bit boring, let's begin with style. I'd like to discuss two separate elements. One, everyone talks about all the time, but the second element is fascinating and I think overlooked. Firstly, the big part, we have syncopation. That means leaning on the off beat. That syncopation is fundamental to rag music. In fact, it's the actual meaning of ragging. When you rag a tune, you make its melody and meter ragged, i.e. leaning on the beats between the beats. Joplin gives us a perfect example in his Peacherine rag, where we get this tune unragged, and then Joplin rags it. Let's hear that again. He does the same thing with this answering phrase here. Now, you need to have a regular beat to do this, otherwise you don't have anything to play your offbeats off against. That regular beat is provided in the left hand, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. That regular rhythmic expectation allows the syncopation to work. In other words, the rather rigid style of the left hand enables the right hand to syncopate the melody more effectively. So, syncopation is an obvious highly important factor in ragtime, but there's another aspect that Joplin uses in his rags that I'd like to discuss, and that's the use of blue notes. Now, I have to admit something. Right at the start of my last video about whether or not Joplin is classical music, I raised a question which I don't think I actually answered. But hang on, isn't this the kind of music they play in American barrooms, not concert halls? And that's because the sound of American barrooms is created by the use of blue notes. Blue notes are those harmonic cracks existing between the established harmonic order, particularly that ambiguity between major and minor modes. A future musical idiom of jazz and the blues, of course. Blue notes are common in Joplin's work, and as he progressed, I think he used them in more and more interesting ways. Take an obvious example, the blue notes in this section of the Paragon rag. It just sounds so bluesy. Or how about this bass line from the Magnetic rag, which is basically your standard boogie-woogie bass line. And let's just hear that again with blue notes added as well. Blue notes are everywhere. And they seem to announce the popular music of jazz, blues and swing that's about to erupt on the scene. So, that's the musicality of rags, syncopation and jazzy blue notes. But how about the structure? Since rags are fairly well structured things. You don't get a single piece, but usually 4 separate sections or strains. And that structure comes from a hugely important genre for understanding rags: American marches. You know, of the John Philip Sousa variety. Marches have a similar structure to rags, and they often have that octave bit at the beginning, you know, to make sure everyone's playing together. And and they also have the oompa style of the bass. So there's a lot of similarity there. Okay, so rags are piano pieces popularised by Scott Joplin at the pivot between 19th and 20th centuries, characterised by syncopation and a jazzy blues idiom. So now let's take a rag as an example, and if we're going to do that, let's take one of my faves. Solace is a little different from the usual Joplin rag in that he uses a habanera bass line instead of the usual straight 1-2-1-2. Yes, habanera, as in Bizet's Carmen. Solace is a wonderfully wise rag. If you don't know it, I recommend listening to the end because I think each section gets better. Now, I'll let the music play and keep the rest of what I've got to say to text on screen. So here it is, Scott Joplin's Solace.